Hello and welcome to Crucible of Words for a little bit of bonus legacy action. With Outlaws of Thunder Junction about to release, I thought I'd go over some of the cards that I think might see some play in Legacy. And there's a lot more in this set than there has been in some of the previous sets, so let's get right into it. Starting down at the bottom, we've got Magda the Horde Master. Now, the other Magda saw a little bit of fringe play as a way of generating some treasure tokens, and there was some like combo-y stuff to do with it. Now, this one is a 2-2, so it's not going to be dying to Orcish Bowmaster, which is quite important. Whenever you commit a crime, create a tapped treasure token. You only get this ability once a turn, but targeting your opponent or anything they control or cards in their graveyard is very easy to do. In Legacy, there's lots of ways of triggering this as well. You can waste down and get a free treasure, and then once you've got some treasures, you can make some dragons, and that's pretty good. Now, is this card going to be like a staple in Legacy or anything? No, but it has the potential to see a little bit of fringe play here and there. There's definitely a lot of cards output treasure tokens, especially with things like Fable the Mirror Breaker. And making some 4/4 dragons, pretty good. You can then copy them with your Fable the Mirror Breaker as well. So you can kind of synergize with things that make tokens, treasure tokens, that is. So this one has a little bit of potential. Next we have Legion Extruder. This is a 2-mana artifact. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to any target. You can pay 2, tap it, sacrifice another artifact, and get a 3/3 golem. Now this isn't an amazing card, but what it does do is allows a Goblin Engineer to go and find this, and then bring it in as a piece of removal. And we've already seen Goblin Engineers in the past getting things like Twin Shot Goblin, I think it's called, that comes in and shoots for 2. That can't get brought back with the Engineer itself. You need the Welder to get alongside it. So what this does is allows Engineer to find a shock, basically, and also put it into play. And sometimes, you know, you're going to have a bunch of excess treasure tokens or whatever, and this can turn them into some guys. I would be surprised to see this becoming like a big staple or anything, but I imagine some Painter players are going to try it out. Next we have Marchesa, Dealer of Death. This is Grixis mana for a 3/4, which is not a bad rate at all. Certainly better than when I started playing. Whenever you commit a crime, you may pay 1. If you do, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of them in your hand and the other in your graveyard. Now, Grixis colors are going to be using their graveyard a lot, whether it's going to be Snapcaster Mages, Murktide Regents, Murderous Cuts, that sort of thing. You're going to be using your graveyard, possibly things like even a few flashback spells here and there, like the black one that exiles cards from people's graveyards that I've temporarily forgot the name of for some reason. But so you're going to be using your graveyard anyway if you're playing Grixis, and this selection is really strong. The downside of this, of course, is that this creature doesn't have any ward, so it's kind of vulnerable to a lot of removal, but it's not going to be getting hit by lightning bolts. So that is something going for it. It's a blue card, so it pitches to stuff. It's a black card, so it pitches to stuff, etc., etc. And if you're playing something like a Strifo pile, where you had the Carpet of Flowers in play, Carpet of Flowers is a really good way of triggering Commit a Crime because it just does it automatically on its own, and it then gives you mana as well. So you can have that in like a 4-color non-white control deck and use that and this to sort of generate a bunch of card advantage. In the past, we've seen cards a little bit like this. I think there might have even been a previous incarnation of Marchesa see play in some Grixis decks. So this one's got some potential, but 3 mana for a creature that can just die is a little bit sketchy. But the way you get paid for it is pretty good, like getting a load of extra cards, and it's not just drawing card, it's selection as well. So the effect is strong. Whether or not the body it's attached to is sturdy enough remains to be seen. And we have a Free Strider Lookout. This is a 3 mana, 3/3 reach. So it's green, so you can fetch it off of Green Sun Zenith, stuff like that, which is automatically an interesting way to look at it. So green creature that you can fetch readily by a staple in Legacy is something that you need to keep in mind. The ability is pretty tasty. Whenever you commit a crime, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a land card from among them onto the battlefield tapped, put the rest on the bottom in a random order. This ability triggers only once each turn. So if you had this and you were to, let's say, wasteland your opponent, you then get to look at the top 5 cards of your library and get a land. That's some pretty good value there. And the body means that it's going to be able to at least trade with things like Delver of Secrets and Dragon's Rage Channeler when they're in the air. Is it an incredible card? No, but you see a lot of weird stuff being played out of Green Sun Zenith decks, and this one is something that people might want to try because the value on it is pretty strong, and a lot of the decks playing Green Sun Zenith already have like a really interesting package of lands they're looking to find. So this kind of plays into that a little bit more. I think the one issue with this, well, one of the issues with this is that it's kind of fighting for that Knight of the Reliquary slot. Whether or not you want this in addition to them, possibly, could be quite interesting. I wouldn't be completely surprised if I saw some people messing around with this, although I'm not expecting it to become a thing that we're going to have to watch out for or play around. Next, we have Caustic Bronco. I like this card quite a lot. Who doesn't like a big snake horse, right? So it's 1 and a black for a 2/2 creature. Snake Horse Mount. What a creature type. So whenever this attacks, you reveal a top card of your library, put it into your hand, lose life equal to its mana value. So this is a Dark Confident trigger when it attacks. And it doesn't have to deal damage, it just has to attack. And there's some extra text where if you've had this saddled, which is where you tap creatures with total power 3 or more, so a bit like, well, exactly the same as crewing, really. So if you do that, your opponent loses a life instead of you. Now that's probably not going to be a thing I'm going to want to do, because if you've got 3 power of creatures, you're probably sending that alongside it to get some damage in. But Dark Confident is a card that used to be a real powerhouse in Legacy once upon a time, and it started fading in terms of how good it was. But then once Orcish Bowmasters came out, it was like you can't even run it in Fringe decks. It's just too bad. This being a 2/2 definitely changes things. You can kind of turn the ability on and off because you decide when you attack. But obviously your opponent can put up blockers, so that decides when you get to attack a little bit as well. But there's a lot to like about this card because it's 2 mana. So you can find this off of something like Breakout, which is a deck that desperately needed a card advantage creature. It's not like a full-on archetype, that deck, yet. But there are people getting 5/0s with a bunch of creatures, and I've played it a bit on my channel as well. And something like this can definitely help in that front. So I think this one has a little bit of possibility to see some play. I do love a Dark Confident more than most, so maybe I'm somewhat biased. Moving on. Embrace the Unknown. This is a 3 mana sorcery. Exile top 2 cards of your library until end of your next phase. You may play those cards. Retrace. So this card, I was pretty reluctant to include it, but I saw somebody talking about it on Twitter and it looked a little bit better than I first thought. So this is basically a divination, but it's a divination that you get to rebuy whenever you draw a land. That could be useful in some later game grindier situations. My problem with this deck, though, is how many red decks are going to be in that sort of grindy situation. And if they are, they're probably going to be playing other colours that have better tools than this. So I'm not wholly convinced by this one, but I've seen a few people talking about it, and maybe there's a place for it. But I thought it was worth a mention at least. And look at that art, it's great. Okay, let's move on. Insatiable Avarice. This is a single black mana to do nothing, but you can pay some more mana to do some actual stuff. So for 3 mana, you get to Vampiric Tutor, which is not great. But for 5 mana, you get to Vampiric Tutor and then draw 3 cards, which is a pretty good rate. And even just black, black, black for drawing 3 cards is, not a million miles away from like the 4 mana lose, the 3 mana lose half your life, draw 4 cards. We're losing a lot less life than in those cards and only drawing 1 less card. So that's probably a fair enough trade. So this card could see play. There's a lot of Dark Ritual decks floating around right now. Maybe this is something where they get to use to like go and find some particular things. We've seen things like Dark Petition see play in the past. That card has kind of fallen out of favor because it's just not as good as things like Beseech the Mirror, which this card may suffer from that a little bit as well. But sometimes you're just going to need a little bit of velocity and you need a bit more gas. And this is a draw 3. So I imagine some people will try and play around with this one a little bit. Slick Shot Show Off is our next inclusion here. So this is a 2 mana 1/2 flying haste. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it gains +2/+0 until end of turn. Now we've seen like Kiln Fiend type stuff play in the past, and sometimes when you have the right sort of density of stuff, you can do some pretty gross things with it. There was, I think it was Modern for a while, there was a very strong Kiln Fiend deck. This is, a similar jam where you're definitely going to get people out of nowhere a little bit. And I think Tony Scapone recently played like a Prowess Burn deck recently, and this would fit in that one very nicely. Like +2 damage for every spell you cast is quite a lot. Now the body's a little bit squishy, but Flying Haste are pretty important words to make sure you can choose your spot. So I'd like to see some decks play. I'd like to play this basically is what I'm saying. I would like to play a fun deck that does this. Whether or not that deck is really good, I'm skeptical, but someone's going to be playing it in Legacy, even if that person is me. Forsaken Miner is our next one. This is a 1 mana 2/2, importantly 2/2. We've seen things like Gravecrawler at 2/1s, and they are obviously limited in their usefulness these days. But anyway, so it's a 1 mana 2/2. It's a skeleton rogue, and rogue is actually an interesting creature type. There's a little bit of rogue support here and there. It can't block, which is standard for these cards, but whenever you commit a crime, you may pay black. If you do, return it from your graveyard to the battlefield. So you wasteland someone, you get your creature back. You thought to someone, you get your creature back. This feels like one of the better versions of this sort of Gravecrawler type effect. So I'm looking forward to trying to jam in some stuff. Skeleton isn't the most useful creature type though, but maybe the rogue thing will do some work here. especially since you have the rogue that whenever you play another rogue, you get to mill your opponent, which isn't necessarily something that is great to do a lot of the time. But that is, I think it's a targeted effect, so you will then trigger other commit crime cards. So perhaps this will be doing something somewhere along the lines. But I do like graveyard recursion creatures, and this one seems like one of the better ones we've had for a while. Fibblethip, Lost on the Range. 1 blue. It's a 1/1, not great in Legacy, but it says Ward 2, which is a pretty big tax on trying to kill this thing. We see things like Patchwork Automaton being really difficult for people to answer at times, so that's quite nice to have. It makes your dazes way better at defending this as well. So you may look at the top card of your library anytime. The top card of your library has Plot. The plot cost is equal to its mana cost. So if you're not familiar with what plot is you pay a cost for a card, and then it goes into exile, and then from the next turn onwards, you can cast that spell when you would normally be able to cast it, like a sorcery or an instant or whatever, without paying its mana cost. So we get to then plot cards from the top of our library and save them up for when they're useful. So this is like a future sight effect, except we get to hold them in reserve. It's not like, okay, I've got a lightning bolt, I'll bolt you or whatever. You say, no, I'll put this bolt into reserve and it's there when I need it. And that is quite a powerful effect. And, you know, it's a blue card as well, so pitches to Force of Will, which is never a bad thing. So I think this card has a lot of potential. Next, we have an interesting card advantage engine here. So this is Lila Undefeated Slickshot. 1 red-blue for a 3/3 with Prowess. That body is okay, but the ability is what we're really playing it for. Whenever you cast a multicolored instant or sorcery spell from your hand, exile that card instead of putting it into your graveyard as it resolves. If you do, it becomes plotted. So there's a few things you can do with this. One of the most interesting is there's some split cards where you can play the 2 mana split card side. And then once it's resolved, you can then play the big 6 mana side from the other side of the card. So you can get like a huge advantage in terms of what you've put in and what you get out. And, you know, just having your spells happen twice is pretty good. So this just gives all your spells like a flashback for when you need it in the future. So that's a really, really powerful effect. Now, it's on a legendary body, so it's a little bit squishy to things like Caracas, but you can definitely do some work with this. I've seen some people talking about playing this with Painter's Servant and just going really wild and having like Force of Wills that then come back. That sounds like something fun that I'd like to try. Whether or not it's good, I doubt it. But I think this card, the power level is there. It's whether or not it's going to fit in with the format and other Legacy decks that are wanting to play it. But this is a potent effect to basically double up all your multicolored spells. Duelist of the Mind. So this is a 2 mana X3 flyer, where X is the number of cards you've drawn this turn. So it's got flying and vigilance, which is pretty good. And whenever you commit a crime, you get to loot. But you only get to do that once per turn, but you can do it on both your turn and your opponent's turn. So you can waste them on your turn and then daze them on their turn, and then you get lots and lots of looting effects. So you power out your graveyard. Graveyard is pretty important in sort of tempo-y decks. So this definitely has a lot of potential. It reminds me a lot of Ledger Shredder, which was a card that people were pretty high on and then eventually realized it wasn't actually all that. So maybe this is going to be a similar situation to that. But there's also a new card from Markov Mana that's kind of got this effect where at the beginning of your combat, you get to put counters on something equal number of cards you've drawn this turn. So maybe there could be a deck that utilizes all these things together. But drawing an extra bunch of cards in Orcish Bowmaster World is not always a free thing to do. But there's a long history of blue flyers that are relatively cheap and do stuff in Legacy. So this one has some potential. Next up we have Sand Scout. This is a 2 mana 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, search your library for a desert card, put that onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Whenever 1 or more lands are put into your graveyard from anywhere, create a 1/1 token. You get that once a turn. So this card is like one of those sort of catch-up cards where if you've been wastelanded or whatever, you can then get ahead. Alternatively, you can wasteland your opponent and then in response vial something like this in. Now, obviously, vial decks are not so hot in Legacy right now. I just don't think they're where you want to be. But this sort of effect is pretty reasonable. It comes with some extra value. And there's always room for like 2 mana white creatures in Death and Taxes somewhere. This also has 2 toughness, which is quite a key number in the format right now. I'm seeing quite a few people listing this one in sort of like the higher list of cards from the set. I'm not hugely convinced because it's a little bit of like a boring white creature, but being able to get extra bodies and, you know, the card advantage of it, if you do get the card advantage off, that's pretty good. I'm not sure what deserts you're realistically playing. There's some dual lands, I guess, and you could run good old-fashioned desert and just really hate on some X1s down the line. Unless there's a desert I've missed. I'm not going to be super impressed with this card, but it definitely has the possibility to do some pretty solid work for a white card. Speaking of white cards, we're now on to Aven Interrupter. This is 1 white for a 2/2 flash flyer. When it enters the battlefield, exile target spell. It becomes plotted. So you exile your opponent's thing, and they get to cast it on another turn that isn't right now. And then spells your opponent's cast from graveyards or from exile cost 2 more to cast while this card is in play. So you're kind of like taxing a spell they've already played. They're going to have to pay 2 colorless mana to get it back later. But this also taxes a bunch of other things. So if your opponent's trying to, like, I don't know, cast Gaia's Will, for example, they're going to have to spend 2 more for each of those cards from the graveyard. Or, you know, Snapcaster Mage. Or if somebody's got a Galvanic Relay going. You know, this card is going to be a pretty decent player against Storm decks because it's going to shut down Galvanic Relay and Gaia's Will. So this one definitely has some use. The enters the battlefield exile target spell is kind of like an additional text from what you're really playing this for. It's more of a taxing creature. And I do like the art on this one. I'm a big fan of birds in general. Next we have Satoru the Infiltrator. Black-blue for a 2/3 menace, which is a pretty reasonable body. We see 3/2 menace creatures seeing play right now. Stalactite Stalker is you know, usually a 2/2 or a 3/3 menace, and that sees a decent chunk of play. But what you're really playing this for is the ability. Whenever this card or one or more other non-token creatures enters the battlefield under your control, if none of them were cast or no mana was spent to cast them, draw a card. So if you picture one of the elementals, you get to draw a card. So Cantrip and Grief sounds great to me. Obviously, ninjas are what this is designed to go with. Every time you ninjutsu a creature in, you draw an extra card, and then this is a ninja as well, so you get to your ninja triggers from your Yuriko or whatever. So this is going to add some juice to ninjas, which is a fringe deck in Legacy, but I've played it a fair bit and done okay with it. You know, it plays a bunch of good cards amongst it, so having a little bit more juice to squeeze from it with a card like this is really important. I can certainly see this being a little bit like a sort of black-blue up the beanstalk in some respects, because you can play this and then have things like Subtlety and Grief doing some pretty good work. And if you reanimate any creatures, that will trigger this, which is pretty good considering Rescaminator is like the #1 deck in Legacy right now. So this is definitely a card that you're going to see some play with. It's only 2 mana, so being a legendary creature isn't that much of a drawback, because if they Caracas it, it's only really costing you a little bit of mana, and you can just, you know, not do it. It's not like you're playing a 4 mana legend that just gets bounced. So this one is going to see some play, I'm sure. Next, we have Archmage's Newt, which has some glorious art. So it's a 2 mana, 2/2 and blue. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, target instant or sorcery card in your graveyard gains flashback until end of turn. The flashback cost is equal to its mana cost. That card gains flashback 0 until end of turn, instead if Archmage's Newt is saddled. Now, we're probably not saddling this. It's a lot like the Bronco. We're unlikely to put the 3 power into this to get something for 0, unless we're trying to do some sort of weird combo deck, which is going to be more fun than competitive. But what this card really reminds me of is Dreadhorde Arcanist, which was a card that was incredibly powerful in Legacy. We're kind of doing the same thing here, right? We're just getting a bunch of free spells by attacking with a creature, which is something we want to do anyway. So imagine we're attacking, we're getting to bolt more stuff, we're getting to cast more cantrips. This is just going to be a really potent card that sort of snowballs. And I think this is definitely one to watch out for, and I'd be surprised if we didn't see this in some Legacy decks in coming weeks. Next we have a bit of an unusual one that I haven't seen many other people mentioning, but this is the Harvester of Misery. So it's 3 black menace. When it enters the battlefield, other creatures get -2/-2 until end of turn. And it has 1 and a black, discard it. Target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn, and it's a 5/4. So 5/4 menace is a pretty reasonable body. And this, again, is one of those cards that does something on the front side to discard itself. So like Grief or like Troll of Khazad-dûm. So you can discard this card to get some value. You know, you can kill a Delver or a Dragon's Rage Channeler early on. It's uncounterable because you're discarding it. It'd have to be a Stifle to stop it. It's going to be able to get rid of a Thalia as well without being taxed. You know, pretty good. And then we get to reanimate it and then kill some more stuff. And if this is just in the graveyard, there's just that constant threat of it being reanimated. So this card, I think, is... I guess this is probably my sleeper pick from the set. Like, there's some obvious cards that are good. This one is one I haven't seen people mentioning, but I think this one is actually pretty interesting to me. And I'm definitely going to fool around with it a fair bit. Next up, we have Geralf the Fleshwraith. So this is a 3-mana, 2/3 legendary creature. So again, it has the weakness of being a legendary creature and Caracas being in the format, but the upside of this card being in play is pretty scary. Whenever you cast a spell during your turn, other than your first spell that turn, get a 2/2 blue and black zombie token. Whenever a zombie enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on it for each other zombie that entered the battlefield under your controller's turn. So this is kind of like a blue Monastery Mentor, and is a pretty good alternate win condition for decks like High Tide out of the sideboard, because you're going to get rid of your removal against the High Tide decks. Then you can just play this and just play a bunch of spells. You don't even need High Tide. You can just make like 10 power pretty easily. So this card can definitely snowball out of control, a bit like Monastery Mentor. And the creatures you're making are not going to be as easily killed as Monastery Mentor tokens, because they're not going to be 1/1s. Now, they're not going to get as big when you do a big turn, but you can do a big turn and then they'll still be big for later on. So I think overall this is going to end up with more power. And again, it's a blue card, pitches the Force of Will, so there's that to like about it too. This one seems like it's going to be a nice pivot plan for some decks for sure. Next, we have the one that most people are going on about as the best card from the set, and I think they're probably pretty close to being right on that one. It's definitely one of the top 2 cards in the set. So this is a 1-mana artifact with 1-mana equip. Equipped creature gets +1/+0, has haste and ward 1. So the reason this card is so good is good old-fashioned Urza's Saga. This can tutor this up, which immediately changes the damage calculations you can get off a Saga. So instead of getting your Shadow Spear and giving yourself lifelink, you can get this, and then the token you've just made then gets to crash as well. So all of a sudden the clock is maybe a turn shorter than your opponent thinks. The ward 1 is not irrelevant either. That's going to force your opponent's resource a bit more when they're already under the gun against all the other stuff you're doing. And I actually like the design of it being +1/+0, because it does still mean that Dress Down can clear out some Urza Saga tokens. But this is definitely going to be a regular thing that you're going to see coming into play off of Urza Sagas in Legacy, and it's really going to mash some people up. Quite a fan of this one. Alright, and now we get to the last card. So this is what I think is probably the best card in the set for Legacy, but there are some caveats with that. So this is a 2-mana, destroy all non-land permanents with mana value 1 or less. So this will destroy the Saga tokens. It will destroy Delver. It will destroy Dragon's Rage Channeler. It will destroy all the Mana Dorks. It will destroy a Bowmaster token. It's going to hit so many things in the format. And you know, sometimes it won't hit anything. And for some reason, they put cycling on this card. So in those situations, you can just ditch it for another card at a pretty reasonable cost of 2 mana. That, to me, seems really good. This is going to prey upon the fact that Legacy decks tend to be really conservative in the manner they want to spend, so you're playing lots of low to the ground cheap threats generally in Legacy, and this is going to clean up a bunch of them. It's kind of like the non-blue Dress Down in some respects in terms of how it's going to interact with Urza Saga tokens, and you just clean those right out, as well as cleaning up the things they tutored for with the Urza Saga. So this one does feel a bit like a screw you Urza Saga type card in a lot of ways, but it's nice to see a non-blue card doing this, and the fact that it is black-white means that it's not that easy to slot in to some decks. So we might see an uptick in things like Esper. There are some people playing like black-white scam at the moment, and this can definitely help them out in a big way against some things they might struggle with, like the Urza Saga, which just gets them value that you can't sort of grief away. So this card is pretty nice. Pitches to Grief, pitches to Solitude. Is just a really, really strong sweeper for the format of Legacy, in my opinion. So I would be flabbergasted if we didn't see this appearing in some Legacy decks. And that is the end of my top 20 Legacy cards from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. There's definitely some other ones I thought about, and, you know, some other people have made some good points, and I think maybe, you know, they should be in this list, and some we've picked are not quite up to scratch. But I think these are some ones that are interesting me as well, and I'd like to see how people innovate and build with these. Now, quite often what happens is you have a big list of like 20 or 30 cards that maybe might be interesting, and then within about 3 months' time, only a handful of them are going to be seeing play. But I think this set is doing more for Legacy than sets we've seen recently. Like Markov Mana did not give us the most amount of tools for Legacy, but this one seems like it has a lot for us. And I think the commit a crime mechanic is something that is going to be very easy to not abuse, but enable, I would say, in Legacy, because you're constantly doing stuff and you're doing it at a cheap rate. You know, things like Thought Seizes, Griefs, Solitudes, Subtleties, even Furies, like obviously all the pitch elementals, but then you've got Daisies and Force of Wills and lots of really cheap interaction that's going to trigger committing a crime. So I think that is something that's worth looking into, and I think we've gone over what I think the best commit a crime cards are for Legacy. But if you've got some ones that you think are good, by all means drop them down in the comments. I'm really interested to see what you think about this new set, because it's kind of exciting in terms of Legacy, which is not something we always get to say when a new set comes out. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this extra bonus content for today. Please remember to like and subscribe if you're enjoying my channel. It really does help me out. And thank you for watching. Goodbye. If you'd like to support me in the channel, please check out my Patreon. It has a free guide to budget turbodepths as well as 3 tiers of support. A low-cost one that enters you into my monthly raffle for a free donation deck on the channel, a mid-tier subscription that gives you access to my detailed turbodepths guide that is updated every month as well as regular articles, and lastly the higher tier gives you all of the above as well as a monthly donation deck for my channel. If you're interested in supporting the channel this way, please check out the link in the description.